Ms. Laline Virasamy, who has been great to this mission with experience throughout throughout the world. And she can introduce the session this morning from the perspective of IOM as the agency, the international agency, but also from our own perspective, from our experience working, especially where migrants are coming from. So without overdue, I'm asking Laline, our Chief of Mission, to address the. Thank you, Laline.
Thank you, Ajit. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your kind words. I do have some experience, but not as much as you have described it. But I'm very glad to be in this call today. And I'd want to welcome and really thank all the NGOs and other service providers that have agreed to be part of this call today. I think it's really an important endeavor that we want to start with maybe more systematically. And I think it's really nice to have such a nice number and wide number here on this call. I'll be very brief because I know colleagues will touch upon the subject more substantially. It's true that I have been in several country contexts where the issue of trafficking pretty much prevails everywhere. And I don't think Europe is not affected by this issue of trafficking in persons or smuggling. On the contrary, it's usually the countries of destination that we're aiming for here. So this year, at least, in spite of COVID, we, with the colleagues, Bridge especially, who is the trafficking focal point in the mission, and Charlene, who works more on vulnerability and the protection of migrants, we have really tried to work with the Department of Justice to see how we could help. It's true that we are part of the NRM and we do support in the assistance of victims for those who want to return home. But there's much more that we can do because we have that network, we have the capacity to train and share as much knowledge as we can with all the experience that we have developed in these specific country contexts around the world where we have supported victims, we have worked on legislations, we have worked in reviewing national referral mechanisms, etc. And this year, you probably know, of course, because you have helped us in promoting it, we launched a campaign at pretty much the same time as the EU Trafficking Day on trafficking. This was a way also to re-emphasize the importance of issues related to irregular migration, but the risks of irregular migration in a context like COVID. It's a trend that we've seen over the years that in context of crisis, in context of pandemics or natural disasters, this is a time where you have smugglers and traffickers that take advantage of this situation. And in addition to the borders being closed even more this year, it was really I think, good opportunities for traffickers to really try to increase their business. And we've seen some of the trends. It's difficult to know the numbers up to now or the impact, but we've seen increased trends in some areas of the world and probably in Europe as well. But we don't have that tangible data, I think, up to now. So I'd like to thank the outreach team also for reaching out to outreach team, which is Ajit, Kuda, and Rebecca, who are on the call. I think it's really important that in the outreach work that we do, we try to reach out to NGOs to try to get as much awareness among yourselves, but also for eventual referrals either to us or referrals to any other service providers here. So I think these types of meetings or networking or exchanges is very important. I know there's a lot of NGOs here. I saw ICI, I saw MRCI joining, that would be joining. I'm not sure, I can't see everyone on the call. But I know all these NGOs have extensive experience already. So I think it would be nice to really exchange with the ones who have more experience with the ones who have less, and would be wanting to have more information and see how they would be able to connect more with this network. Maybe one last thing, and you probably know it already, is that the Department of Justice is reviewing the national referral mechanisms right now. We are part of that team, and I understand very shortly that they will be sharing something with a wider audience. So we're looking forward to also revamping, that the government also revamps a few of the processes here so that it becomes more operationable and just probably up to date with the current context in a way. So I'll stop here. Thanks a lot, Ajit and the team, for taking the lead on that. And I'll stay a few minutes and then I have to shift to another meeting at 10:30. But thanks a lot. And over to you.
Thanks very much, Lalini. I wish we were all together physically. And so we'll be kind of circle and giving you a cup of tea and start chatting, but we can do it still. So I think before even we start the discussion, it will be good for us to know each other. We are not so many. Very quickly, maybe we can just say who we are, what organization we're coming from, to create that kind of ambience, because some of the people may not have the chance to speak at the end, but I really want to hear the voice of everybody. So we're going to start. I will see the names that are appearing. I will call you one by one. So you can just say briefly what organization you're coming from. I will start with Felipe Lopez. No, Felipe is not there. Anna Igni.
Yeah, hello. I'm Anna. I work with Offaly Domestic Violence Support Service on an ethnic minority development project, and we have just got funding for next year. So I'm delighted. I'm ready to work with all of you and learn lots for next year.
Thanks, Anna. Anne Nolan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anne Nolan, and we are Waterford Integration Services. We have worked with victims of human trafficking in the past, both from Eastern Europe and outside the European Union. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Thanks, Anne. I see anti-trafficking. I don't know what name is, who is the person?
It's ICI, Immigrant Council. My name is Jennifer Okeke Campbell. I'm the Anti-Trafficking Officer for Immigrant Council of Ireland. Thank you.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks very much. Caroline Mooney. Hello? Caroline Mooney.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Caroline Mooney, and I am from Akidwa. That is the Migrant Women's Network. I am the Migrant Women's Health Coordinator. And I want to say that we just did a research which was very, very informative on human trafficking. And so I'm here to learn and maybe share what we learned from our research. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Caroline. Andrew is our colleague. Andrew.
Hello, my name is Andrew Chisholm. I work in operations here in IOM Ireland. I'd work quite closely with the outreach team, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the speakers today.
Thanks. Andrew. I see CISC again. So must be one of the colleagues from
CISC.
CISC.
Hi, my name is Leila Bunwar. We are two colleagues here. That's right. My name is Leila Bunwar. I'm working with Immigrant Support Center in Clare. Okay.
Thanks very much, Leila. Deborah is our colleague. Deborah.
Hi, how are you? My name is Deborah. I'm part of IOM and I work in the communications department. Yeah, I'm very glad to be here with all of you.
Sergeant Dermont.
Hello, Dermot Delaney is my name, and I'm a sergeant with the Garda National Diversity and Integration Unit. We would have national responsibility for all our external facing issues with members from minority and diverse backgrounds. So delighted to be here and hoping to learn.
Thanks very much, Dermot. Jacqueline, we met yesterday. Jacqueline O'Rourke. Hello, Jacqueline. Oh, she's quiet. Laila. Laila already spoke there.
Hi, I'm Laila. I'm from CISC.
CISC, yes.
And I have my colleague here. She can say her.
Thank you.
We are
Last
two
coordinator, LASC coordinator. I don't know, there is no name there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Alba, sorry.
Yes.
Hi, yes, I am Alba Martos. I'm the current LASC coordinator, the Latin American Solidarity Center. And what we do is most development education activities, courses, and talks within the Latin American communities in Ireland.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. We must keep in touch there. Louise.
Yeah.
Louise.
Hello there. My name is Louise O'Rourke. I do management consultancy in the development sector, work with different organisations, and I'm just trying to increase my knowledge. I became more aware of trafficking when I worked in Nigeria. So yeah, I'm just trying to increase my knowledge.
Wonderful. I'm going to skip my colleague Breed and Charlene because you're going to face them very shortly. H, I can see MH. I don't know who is that.
Sir.
Oh, Ahmed. Ahmed, you are muted.
It's Ahmed from Doris
yes.
in Limerick. The integration support worker in Limerick.
Ahmed. Thanks very much, Ahmed. Thanks for attending. And we have also our colleague Kuda, who have been in contact with you. Kuda, maybe you can just raise your hand because people never seen you. They met you by email. And Kuda will be there very much with you. And Natalia, one of our supporters. Natalia Pestova. Natalia, we can't hear you, Natalia. We'll see you again. I know you'll speak. Olivia? Olivia, no. Ropa Benjamin?
Hi, my name is Ropa Fadzobem with the team for Secretary Children Seeking Asylum. I'd like to learn quite a lot in terms of the practical work that IOM does, especially for trafficked children. And I would like also to learn how you link up with the GNIB Human Trafficking and Investigation and Coordination Unit. What sort of with the GNIB in the event, for example, where we have that we may suspect to be trafficked.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. Susie Conan? We can't hear Susie. Louise O'Connor, UL student.
Hi, yeah, I'm a student of psychology at UL and just interested in learning anything related to migration and integration and trafficking, and yeah, interested in learning about this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Wilfred? I can't see you, Wilfred. And we have Rebecca also, who is one of colleagues here. Outreach, Rebecca, maybe you can just show yourself so that they can see you. Now, I'm going to invite now my colleague, Charlene. Charlene is the focal point in IOM, who is in charge of migrant vulnerability. She's going to give you a very short brief on the vulnerability approach used by IOM to support migrants. But saying this, on Saturday, we're going to have a dedicated webinar on migrant vulnerability that will be facilitated by the specialist person in IOM from our headquarters, who works on vulnerability, or even she wrote a book on migrant vulnerability, and we'll very much invite all of you, if you have time, to attend that meeting, because it's quite comprehensive in terms of what is migrant vulnerability and what approach can we use when supporting vulnerable migrants. So We're going to have a webinar at 12 and another one at 1:30. So whoever have time on Saturday, it will be good. You can contact Kuda. Kuda will send you the link for that meeting. But I'm going to invite Charlie now to give briefly kind of our narrative on vulnerability of migrants before we speak about support provided to victims of trafficking. So Charlene, maybe you can say something about yourself first before you speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Ajid. Hi, everyone, and thanks again for joining today. So you're all very welcome. My name is Charlene Sadiq, and I'm the Senior Protection and Programme Officer here at IOM. I'm here almost 10 years now. So I'm delighted to see you all. I know I see a lot of familiar faces out there, so it's lovely to see. So today we're going to talk about trafficking and vulnerabilities. It's not the happiest of topics, but it is an important one. And we're going to talk about our assistance to vulnerable migrants and how it's going to change going forward into 2021. So we've divided the webinar into two presentations. One is this one, which is going to be very, very brief, and it's just to give you a very general overview of IOM's AVRR program and how we approach vulnerabilities through that. And the next stage is the more interactive stage where we're going to take a closer look at one particular vulnerable group that we assist, which is victims of trafficking. And through that presentation then, which is more interactive, we'll illustrate how we actually approach the caseload and what we do and why. So the types of supports that we offer and how the actual programme translates into reality. So Andrew, my colleague, is sharing the presentation. So Andrew, if you wouldn't mind going on to the next stage, the next slide. So basically, the presentation today is going to take three forms. We're going to touch on three areas: AVRR, who is considered vulnerable, and how do we address vulnerabilities in the assistance we offer. So if there's any questions that you have throughout, please do feel free to ask. And also there's a text box that you can put in any questions, and myself and Breed will answer throughout the presentation or at the end. So we'll go on to the next. So AVRR, so the Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration Programme aims to assist migrants who are unable or unwilling to remain in host or transit countries, and they wish to return voluntarily to their countries of origin. Each of the IOM AVRR programmes are rooted in the foundation that the rights of migrants must be respected and protected, regardless of their nationality or migration status, and without discrimination, in order to preserve their safety, their physical integrity, their well-being and dignity. So we looked at that foundation this year in our programming, and we actually tried to evolve the 2021 programme in line with that, specifically looking at the migration status. So traditionally, and for the last 19 years, IOM Ireland has structured its return process around groups primarily on their status here. So irregular migrants, asylum seekers, victims of trafficking and others. But the world has changed, and Ireland has changed, and migration has changed. So we recognise now that migrants can't be grouped, and your status doesn't and should not dictate your need for help. And we found ourselves very curtailed the last few years especially, and we know that the programme needed to evolve with those who so desperately we wanted to assist, and those who are in need of support but who were actually falling through the gaps. So we did consult with colleagues and friends from the NGO sector, and we looked at how our caseload could evolve and could change, and we've decided to expand the criteria for those eligible to return. So for 2021, and working closely with the Department of Justice, the 2021 programme will look to assist any migrant, regardless of status, who is vulnerable and in need of assistance to support their decision to return. So this includes migrants in vulnerable situations such as domestic abuse, addiction issues, single parents, mental health issues, homelessness, destitute, etc. So I suppose a lot of you are sitting there going, well, how do you decide who is vulnerable and who is not? So IOM uses the definition of vulnerable migrants, which is set out in the Principles and Guidelines on Human Rights Protection of Migrants. And it says that vulnerable migrants are migrants who are unable effectively to enjoy their human rights, are at increased risk of violations and abuse, and who accordingly are entitled to call on a duty bearer's heightened duty of care. So nice and broad, but it's good because it does need to be, and it stops people from being left behind. And I suppose in an ever-changing world, the opportunity needs to be afforded to any person in any situation. So in my eyes, I suppose if you ask for help, it must mean that you need it. And it makes me think that all of this negative dialogue that migrants are getting in the news today and in the media, and, you know, I struggle to understand how people can launch such, you know, horrible verbal attacks because, you know, and they say things like migrants are only here for what they can get. In my experience, migrants come for what they can actually offer. And they have hopes and they have dreams and they have plans, and they invest in the notion of being part of a new society where they'll be included and part of the team, and they want to work and be self-sufficient and they want to belong. So that's why when migrants do approach us for assistance, that we know then that absolutely they must need it and something must have gone terribly wrong for them here to be at our front door. And it's our job here at IOM to be able to help them, I suppose, in the best possible way and look at what went wrong for them and the reasons why. So we go on to the next slide there, Andrew. So I know that some of you are also sitting there thinking, but you just book flights, and we do book flights, but we're not a travel agent, and we are here to offer migrant support when they need it most. And like I said, with vulnerable migrants, it is often the case that something has happened here to make them want to be at home or feel that they need to be at home. So our program is not just to book flights, but also to offer support to migrants to make sure that they are leaving Ireland safe and in the knowledge that they're making their own decision, and that the decision is based on what they feel will offer them the best possible opportunity. So for us, it's actually not a matter of how many people we assist, but it's more of who we assist and why we're assisting them. So on the next slide is just a brief diagram of the AVRR program. And you'll see it comes in 3 stages: the pre-departure, the travel stage, and the post-arrival. So for vulnerable migrants, I suppose a lot of work is put into the pre-departure stage and the post-arrival stage. We work very, very closely with migrants in a vulnerable situation to ensure that they get the best possible support in order to feel safe and have that safety blanket when they return, but also to ensure that their return is the best possible option for them and it is a sustained return. So in order for us, so if we go on to the next slide, sorry, Andrew. So in order for us to assist someone, we need to know why they are returning and what they need in terms of supports. And in the next presentation, we'll discuss this further and we will give proper actual examples, but I wanted to give you a general idea as to the types of cases that we usually assist and why it is so important for us to look at each layer of vulnerability in order to ensure that the migrant makes an informed decision and that it's a right one for them. So the main factor of the AVRR program is that it is informed and it is voluntary, and nobody should feel pressurized into returning, and they should only return once they have all of the information. So for a number of reasons, it can sometimes be difficult for vulnerable migrants to process and retain information or to assess their options objectively. And I suppose with some mental health cases, even to make the decision is difficult for them. So it's therefore our responsibility to ensure that no formal application is ever taken before the issues are addressed. And IOM has worked with cases of individuals who've been hospitalised with severe mental health issues. We've worked with them for periods of months in order to get them to a place where they can make a decision and to assess their options. In some cases, they've disappeared once they've been discharged. In other cases, we proceeded with the return. We've worked with students who've actually been treated for drug-induced psychosis, whereby we've had to call family members back home who've been looking for them. We've travelled with migrants on flights. We've provided escorts, layperson escorts, medical escorts. And we basically provide that safety net for them throughout the whole process. Another point that we need to make sure of is that the return feels right for the migrant. A person needs to return not only physically, but also emotionally too. So if they leave thinking that they're not doing the right thing, then they will forever question their decision, and it will have a huge impact on them emotionally and mentally. So in vulnerable cases, we need to recognize that the decision to return may be a consequence of a situation that happened here, like a breakdown of a relationship, a loss of employment, a loss of their health, and there's a grieving process that they need to go through, and that we ourselves need to address with them. And we also need to empower the migrants. So many times they feel disempowered and they feel powerless. So we give them the options for both here and for return, and we allow them to feel ownership on their decision. So with vulnerable migrants, the challenges will almost always be present, and it's our role to try and foresee some of these obstacles and to help the migrant to actually navigate them. So some of the cases that we've worked on have flee in a domestic violence situation, and they actually had to return to their country of origin and face their spouse's family, or somebody's been diagnosed with a communicable disease which may cause issues post-return, or there may be a stigma attached to it. So in these cases, we actually do rely heavily on our colleagues in country missions to support us, and they will oftentimes speak with the beneficiary virtually here and provide them with information of what to expect and what support services are in place and how IOM can assist post-return. And they make contact with family members, and they also prepare them for return. So if it's somebody with mental health issues or medical issues, we'll have briefed them before the person returns in order to prepare the family for them, because there'll be a grieving process for them also. In terms of the medical cases, we have linked, and we do link quite regularly, medical teams both here in Ireland and in the country of origin to ensure that there's a continuum of care. So what that means is the medical teams here will speak with the medical teams in the country of origin, and they'll discuss treatment plans, medication, the availability of medication. And what that does is means that there's no gaps in the actual treatment of the migrant, and it also means that if there's any issues with medication or being able to obtain the medication in the country of origin, the teams here have the opportunity to actually change the medication and assess the change before the person travels. So I suppose what I wanted to get across here is that return isn't an easy process, and it can actually be a very difficult decision to make at times, at a very hard time in migrants' lives. And we at IOM, we never give misleading information, and we do try to keep it real. But I suppose we spend a lot of our time managing expectations. And like I said, we do arrange virtual counselling sessions with the migrants to discuss the situation in home, and we're here to discuss the situation in Ireland. And this has proved especially effective during COVID and with the vulnerable caseload, so that people know exactly what they're returning to and what awaits them, and they can prepare then for the challenges and the opportunities. So what I will finish up now, because I want to go on to the next presentation, which is specifically around the caseload of trafficking. But what I would say is that to be vulnerable is relative, and everyone perceives, feels, and reacts differently. And what may not be a challenge to you or I may be a challenge to someone else, but it doesn't matter if what you're feeling is stopping you from fully functioning or meeting your needs. Then to us, you're vulnerable and you have every right to ask for help. So it's important for these people to get the help that they need, and that we are assisting people in society who can't actually advocate for themselves or can't navigate the systems or feel that they don't have a voice. So we're not here to make a decision for anybody, but we are here to allow people to make their own decisions. And with vulnerable cases, the only difference, I suppose, really to the regular AVRR program is that we're spending a little extra time in getting people to the point where they're ready to take back their power and decide for themselves and take ownership over their decisions and decide what's in their best interest and what's the next step. So I'm really going to finish on that in terms of vulnerabilities, but I did want to take the opportunity to say that going forward into 2021, we'll be looking at all vulnerabilities regardless of status and aiming to assist, those most in need if they so wish to return. We're going to use the next presentation as a more interactive presentation to discuss the victims of trafficking and the type of assistance that we offer victims here in Ireland and why we work cases the way that we do. So we're hoping that it will open up a discussion around that and that you can get involved in that with us. So,
Thanks,
okay, I'm going to
Charlene.
just
Yeah.
stop there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Charlene. Before you jump into the main presentation on victims of trafficking, which is a kind of a particular, a service within the services that we provide to vulnerable migrants, I would like to tell to all of you that this meeting is recorded. I hope you don't mind. And after the meeting, we're going to share it with our social media. So that people who did not have the chance to attend the meeting can also hear about the discussion on the topic. But before I invite Charlene again and with our colleague Bridge to talk about victim trafficking, I think our Chief of Mission want to raise something. Malini?
Yeah. Thanks, Ajit. Sorry, I wasn't planning to come in, but I saw a question from Olivia on the question related to whether IOM can assist migrants who are subject to a deportation order. I think that's a very important question that comes not just here, but in a lot of countries, whether, we can call it deportation order, we could call it forced return, we could call it different terminologies, but ultimately, the work that IOM has done from the outset, and it's enshrined in the constitution of IOM, is in Article 1 of the constitution. So it's literally one of the priorities of the work that we do is that we endeavor to work with government to find alternative to forced return. So therefore, we do not assist in the movement operation of a deportation order at all. And on the contrary, we try to really encourage that instead of effecting a deportation order or going in issuing a deportation order, that the person is allowed and given the chance to decide for himself or herself to go back home or whatever other alternative is available to him based on vulnerabilities. If the return is not also an option for that person, then it's also our role in a way with you all to advocate for that. There could be several reasons why a return could not be possible. Charlene talked about medical availability in that country, talked about other vulnerabilities of victims of trafficking where return would be more risky for that person to go back home. So definitely the question, the answer is no, we're not in a position to support a deportation order. However, this will come in our policy next year because we are issuing a new policy in IOM, and the policy will be very clear now that IOM can assist in pre-counseling prior to a deportation order. If counseling or any support is required from us, this is something that we can offer to the migrant or upon return. So it's not linked to the movement of a deportation order, which we are against. And this is the ultimate responsibility of the government and authorities. But once the person has returned, and we have programs that do assist people that have returned, then we take over in really assisting the person in the reintegration. So I hope that's clear. The answer is no, we don't, but there are areas where we can provide counseling or support upon return as well. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Lalini. I know there are some questions that are still pending there. We're going to come back to that, and Kuda is going to manage all the questions, put them to the speakers, but we'll also give you opportunity to speak out, raise questions yourself directly. And we want it to be kind of more a dialogue than just question and answers. Maybe Charlene and Bridge, you can go into the presentation on support to victims of trafficking now. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'll just take a minute to introduce myself. My name is Breach, and I work with the team. So on my title, I'm Senior Program and Operations Coordinator for the mission. And basically what that means is that I'm involved in a lot of the day-to-day movement and operations, some of which Charlene has already touched upon. So the practical day-to-day assistance of the cases, I would work with a team. So Andrew and Rachel, she's not on today, would work very closely on assisting people with return, with resettlement, with relocation, family unification, and we also link in quite closely with the outreach team. Because they're usually a lot of the time the first port of contact for a lot of the people who are interested in availing of the projects that we assist with. So my role in IOM, I'm also the CT focal point, and basically what that means is that I would work with the protection assistant, who is Charlene and who you've already met, and also another colleague on the return and reintegration of victims of trafficking. We also try to help out and give information and training on a needs basis. Some of the training is basically just to get the information out there on what IOM does to assist victims of trafficking. And as Lalini mentioned earlier, we've also been involved in some other activities with the Department of Justice in the last year, which has been great. So we've been involved in a counter-trafficking campaign that started around the end of October. There's some images there on the screen that you can see. And basically the focus of this campaign was just to try and highlight to the public what trafficking in Ireland can look like. So I know we've a great mix of people on the webinar today, so thank you so much for joining. And I know a lot of you will have experience of working directly with victims of trafficking or research into same. I know it might be the first time that you're learning a little bit about this, or you may not have had interactions with victims. So we're trying to basically address everybody here today and talk a little bit about something that might interest you. So the campaign, after speaking with a lot of the NGO, civil society and government departments that work with hands-on with victims of trafficking, we try to speak to them about what the needs are of the general public at the moment. What we felt from our work with victims of trafficking is that a lot of the time people don't know what a victim of trafficking is. Like we all have the stereotypical images. We know that you know, a girl can be a victim of trafficking for sexual exploitation. She can be locked in an apartment. She can be escorted wherever she goes. But at the same time, there can be a woman who's working as a victim of trafficking. She's been sexually exploited, but she doesn't have the same level of controls as that other girl. She could be out in the cafe having a cup of coffee, but there's another level of control that's keeping her where she is, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Then there's, you know, there's labour exploitation that doesn't get into the media all that often, and the general public may not be aware of it. Child trafficking happens in Ireland. There's just so many industries now where trafficking can happen that this awareness campaign, we try to basically illustrate to the public that anybody can be exploited. It's not just your stereotypical images, and also that anyone can be involved in the exploitation. But we'll touch a little bit on that later on. So we're just going to touch around some of the basics of human trafficking here, and I know a lot of you might know a little bit about this, but we'll just run over quickly. And this is a lot of what we do in our training as well. So we can do quite basic level trainings, or we can do more in depth depending on the audience. But what we wanted to talk about today is what human trafficking is, the differences between human trafficking and smuggling, because often we find the two can be quite mixed in the media, and it's quite important for the public to understand the difference. The national referral mechanism in Ireland, who does what and when and why also. As Lalini mentioned earlier, the Irish government is currently reviewing the national referral mechanism, and I know many of you here today who are familiar with this will you know, agree that we need to do this, and it's a great move for Ireland. So it's great that they're looking at this at the moment. And also we'll go into a little bit more detail about how IOM assists victims of trafficking. So just before I launch into a big speech, I'll just say as well that Charlene is the protection focal point of the mission. I know she introduced herself earlier, but we work very closely with our beneficiaries and also with training and things like that. So it's important for this to happen because for our operations, while we're working with our beneficiaries one-on-one and we're trying to tailor the assistance, AVR, family unification, whatever it may be, to each person as they come to us, it's very important that protection is mainstreamed in all of our projects. So Charlene is looking at all the processes with our headquarters and making sure that those protections are inbuilt into our projects and that we really look at the assistance we provide to beneficiaries in a holistic manner, so that we can give them all the assistance that they need. Okay, so human trafficking involves the sale, trade and exploitation of human beings for profit. Sorry. You just might ask that person to mute themselves. Sorry. So the reason we try to break this down a little bit is because, you know, you think about what human trafficking is, and you know, every day I have been, you know, when I'm working on trafficking, I can't understand why people would do it. And sometimes you might come across a trafficking situation and it turns out not to be trafficking, or it can be quite difficult sometimes to identify what is trafficking and what isn't. So basically, we took a look at the international legislation, and while there might be many situations where there's vulnerable migrants that need help, it's very important that for a victim of trafficking to be identified as a potential victim, that there's 3 elements involved, and those elements are the act, the means, and the purpose. And we try to break this down into simplified terms to just make it a little bit easier for people to understand what that means, because sometimes it can get quite complicated. But basically, by the act of trafficking, what we mean is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, or receipt of persons. Now, this can be all sorts of things. Recruitment can actually mean recruitment. We've seen people answer ads for jobs on Facebook where they see, you know, a cleaning job being advertised, and they end up talking to the person, making an application, and they think this is a great job. It can also be, we've seen people who are we've started calling it almost romantic trafficking, where they're, you know, befriended by somebody, they end up entering into a relationship with someone, and the person asks them to move to Ireland, and then suddenly they're usually it's a boyfriend is convincing them or forcing them into prostitution because they need to pay the bills. He tried to get them a job, there was nothing else they can do. I've seen recruitment where a friend of a friend, an acquaintance from a village, has told somebody in a family that you know, the guy from down the road, he's working over in a factory in Ireland, and they need more people, so if you can help me find more people, that would be great. And then suddenly you've got 10 people from a village all talking to this person because they know somebody already in Ireland who loves the job, and they're all willing to go to Ireland. Transportation, you know, it means what it says. It's we have traffickers who have assisted people with getting passports for the first time, getting their travel documents, IDs for the first time, with booking flights, booking buses, whatever it might be. And then they say, you know, it's fine, we'll help you to get to Ireland, and then you can pay that back to me when you get there. So sometimes they're forced to pay it back in debt bondage, and sometimes they're not. But the transportation costs, you know, you and I might know that a flight would cost a certain amount of money, but suddenly they come to Ireland and they're being told that they owe thousands of euros for a flight that may not have cost that much at all. And then it starts to keep building up because suddenly they have to pay for rent and all the rest of it. Also, we tried to explain the act, we tried to break it down a little bit further, because sometimes people think they might not be involved in trafficking because they're not exploiting, when actually the harbouring and the receipt of persons as well, this is all part of the act. So if you meet someone at Dublin Airport and you're assisting them to move on to a trafficking exploitative situation, that's all part of the trafficking situation. Now the means, this is a little bit self-explanatory: threats, use of force, deception, coercion, or abuse of power. So some of those are fairly obvious, you know, the stereotypical image of the woman locked in the apartment who's not allowed to go anywhere. There's use of force, there's coercion, there's abuse of power, threats, all sorts of stuff. But what about that girl who's in the cafe having her cup of coffee? Why has she not run away and freed herself? And a lot of the time is that there's psychological manipulation, there's coercive control, and there is threats. Like these traffickers are so incredibly clever. Charlene always says to me, she always comments, if they put their means to something good, they could really change the world, and instead they do this. But we've met people who stayed in trafficking situations for, months and years because the trafficker knew where their daughter was living with the grandmother at home, and all it took was just one sentence from them saying, if you leave, we will kill your daughter, and that was it. She stayed. So there's some very obvious reasons, and then some less ones that to you and I, if you're in such a horrible situation, you think, why is she not getting out of there, or he? And then the purposes is exploitation. It's profit-making industry. So the profit making, a lot of you might know by now, but the estimation globally is that trafficking makes $150 billion per year. So I think in the world rankings of trafficking, I think it's number 3rd after drugs and weapons. So you can see that this is an absolutely huge industry, and the risk reward is completely unbalanced because internationally, like not just in Ireland, but internationally and globally, the amount of money that's put into fighting trafficking is just nowhere near scratching the surface of what's needed, because the legislation and that's in different countries, and the amount of arrests and the amounts of convictions, the risk reward is just completely unbalanced. It's 100% it's worth it for them to do it, because there's estimations that you can make up to 100,000 euros or dollars off one woman in prostitution trade. So when you're up against that, and you're talking about fines or small prison sentences depending on the country, it's really worth the reward. So another thing we wanted to touch on was human trafficking and smuggling. Everybody has heard the two terms, and everybody's seen it in the Irish media as well. You see people coming through Rosslare Port. They're on trucks, and then either they're discovered at the port, or later on they emerge and claim asylum and things like that. So the distinction is quite important, because a lot of the time, people smuggling, we have found that people, they do. Basically, I think what we know it means is that people are paying somebody to cross a border illegally. So they're finding a way to come to Ireland, is the example. So they're finding a way to come to Ireland. They've paid someone, whether it's through false documents or whatever, or paying for transport or whatever it is. But there is a benefit to that person. They've contracted this person to get them from one place to another. Now, people who have been smuggled, it doesn't mean that horrendous things haven't happened to them, or that they're that they aren't vulnerable. We've all heard the stories of what can happen, and they level of assistance. Often, sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But a lot of the time, people smuggling can also turn into trafficking. So sometimes you find that people have paid to come to, say it's Ireland. They've gone through this process, and when they get here, suddenly they're being told, actually, you owe me another 20,000 euros for X, Y, and Z, and then they're involved in debt bondage. And this is when a situation comes to trafficking. But it's not always, people smuggling isn't always human trafficking, and human trafficking isn't smuggling. So the two things can be quite connected. But a lot of the time they're not, and sometimes when it is reported in the media, you see that the two terms are used interchangeably, and it's just quite important to get it out there, the difference between the two, because I suppose they both have their own sets of vulnerabilities, and they both need different kinds of assistance depending on what they've been through. So this is just a diagram we like to use, which shows the difference between trafficking and smuggling, and I'll just leave it there for a couple of seconds for you to take a look at. And as Ajit mentioned, this has been recorded, but we can share any of the information by email. Our information will be shared at the end of the presentation, and of course we're happy to answer any questions. So this is one of the scenarios we wanted to look at with you, and we find that these scenarios can be quite good for people who aren't really familiar with trafficking and smuggling, as it gives a little bit of an introduction. So I'll just leave you a few seconds to read it, and then we might ask some questions about it. I would add as well that, you know, we've obviously invited you here today as well for your expertise and also to hear from yourself. So if anybody does want to add to the discussion or chat, please just put up your hand and Ajit can let you jump in.
Especially, you know, and what I would like to hear, because it always baffles me, the confusion around smuggling and trafficking, you know, as in if you've come across any where there's a crossover or there has been that grey area where you found it difficult to label it smuggling or trafficking, or and your experience with that.
I just want to say also that and the reason that we wanted to be with agencies because you are exposed to so many migrants, and sometimes you may not even know the background of the migrant. Trafficking, it's a quite sensitive thing, and migrants may not even say it to you, yet they suffer a lot. So it's quite important for you to get to know all those facts, so that if ever you are able to detect anything, you can take it at different level and connect with Ireland. So if you have any questions, Kuda is here, who will be managing all this, but it will be very important for us now to start interacting and not necessarily asking questions, but you can also share about your experience yourself, how you interact with migrants in this area. Thank you.
I would just like to add as well that one of the biggest issues, I suppose, or challenges that we're seeing is exactly what Breed talked about there in terms of how trafficking is evolving and it's ever changing. So it's very, very hard to actually keep up. And I'm not ashamed to say that, but it's just a case that sometimes the migrants we come across don't actually even recognize themselves that they have been trafficked, and they don't know the signs. And like that, everyone has this traditional view of somebody being locked in a room or tied against a radiator, and it's often not the case, and it's especially not the case for Breach and I for the cases that we've been recently working on. A lot of the times the migrants themselves have or the victims themselves have agreed to the pay, you know, they've agreed to work for say €300 a month because that's what they feel, or that's what is the acceptable pay or salary in their own country, so they don't think that there's any issue with it. Or we have girls who are in a relationship or feel that they're in a relationship and that, you know, they're just going through a bad patch and they don't understand or they can't recognize the exploitation. So I'd be interested to see, is that something that you yourselves are coming across? Because we most certainly are, and it's been happening for the last the last year really, where it's predominantly the majority of our cases are those who don't actually recognize the trafficking.
And I suppose from our perspective as well is a lot of the time, a lot of our trafficking victims are referred to us in by NGOs and Gardaí. So by the time they come to us, they have been identified as trafficking victims. But sometimes we've come across people who apply to us just through our voluntary return programme. And this is where our vulnerability assessments and all that protection that we're talking about comes into play, because we sit down and we talk to somebody about their interest to return home. And then Ajit has alluded to it there, like we don't know the background and they say they want to return home. We go through it and then slowly but surely some of the indicators start to come out. And once you start to sit down and talk to them and build a relationship with them, you're able to get a little bit more of that story and start referring them into services where it's needed. So this is why we're constantly talking about protection and mainstreaming it into our services, because we want to try and help as many people as possible and make sure that we can identify people.
And just to add to that, and then I will stop talking, we are very conscious, and this is why the trafficking campaign was so important to us. We are very conscious that with COVID and going into 2021, the aftermath of COVID, I suppose, we're going to see an awful lot of migrants in an extremely vulnerable situation who are going to find themselves I suppose more likely to get involved in exploitation or become victims of trafficking. So people who, you know, again, we're going to see an evolution whereby we're going to see it evolve, whereby people who would not normally be susceptible to being victims are now going to be ever more vulnerable. So we would like you to keep that in mind and maybe open that up for discussion as well in terms of ways that we could offer assistance.
And I suppose one of the things we've seen, and a lot of you will have seen today, is that the assistance that our beneficiaries need hasn't stopped during COVID, and particularly trafficking hasn't stopped. You know, the exploitation is still there. You know, there's still ways for them to make money, and it's such an adaptable industry that they always find new ways to exploit and traffic their victims. So it's still important for us to keep learning, as Charlene said, and to work together.
I can see Anne Nolan has her hands up. Anne?
Thanks, Ajida. I'd just like to make a comment in relation to the case example that's given. It says there that Elizabeth has been working as a prostitute since she was 14, but we don't know anything else. Is that something that is endemic in her family? What has been her supports to date around that? But for us, we would look at that in terms of, you know, that she entered into a voluntary kind of smuggling situation in the beginning, which then became a trafficking situation because a lot of this was done against her will. We would also see that there was a lot of cross-border organised crime, which would again add to that person's vulnerability because they know that they knowingly have gone into a situation in crossing the border, knowing that they didn't have maybe the correct paperwork or the right contacts or the right details for that. So that's something else that keeps people embedded in trafficking. They know that they themselves have I suppose maybe broken the law for want of a better word. So like it's not as cut and dried because she's also under 18. She's immediately a special case in terms of immediate supports and linked in with other services, basically child services. So we would be looking at that from a number of different avenues. But we would always, you know, wherever there's any doubt for us, we have been very fortunate in that we've worked with IOM since about 2008. And wherever we were in doubt about a potential victim, we have always liaised with IOM, who has confirmed then whether that is a genuine case of trafficking or whether it's smuggling or whether it's something else. So I would be appealing to everybody to use your services. You know, if in doubt, link in with yourselves and go through the steps, the requirements that helps to identify, to ensure then that the client, the person that we're working with, gets all the supports that they require and to make sure that nothing is missed. So that would be just kind of our comment on that.
Thanks very much, Anne. That's a very, very helpful one.
And I would just add to what Anne said there is that you've hit on two very, very key points out of this story, is that that will be one of the threat mechanisms that we see people being used against victims a lot of the time, is that they have also broken the law. You know, we've had victims of trafficking who've been involved in drug dealing, and also a lot of people are told that their immigration status will be held against them, that they've come into the country illegally, and this is a way of keeping them in their situation. And of course, you touched on the age thing as well, which is a very key factor. So one of the things with child victims of trafficking is that only two of the elements need to be present, because a child cannot make a decision about moving and about you know, making that decision to move to Ireland or wherever it might be. So they would be considered a trafficking victim, definitely.
Thanks very much. I see Ropa Benjamin has a hands up as well. Benjamin? Can you unmute yourself, please, Benjamin?
So thank you very much. I think what I simply want to share, what I've learned here, is just to use the shorthand of the definition of trafficking. That's what I've learned greatly here, that if you, especially for me who works with minors, when we do our assessment, it is, I think I've gained that we should ask 3 questions. You know, to look at the plan that was made for the journey, the minor and the means. Was force used, was deception used, and then the third, the purpose for the young person to come in the country. Is it for exploitation or not? To distinguish it from smuggling. So I think this shorthand of asking or assessing three issues is key from what I have learned here. It's just a contribution.
Thanks very much, Benjamin.
And I would say from our perspective, I'm working in IOM nearly 13 years now and with victims of trafficking for maybe around 6 years. And if there's one thing I've learned is that if in doubt, always ask. So it's so good to hear everybody jumping on board and saying the things to look out for, but also that they're so willing to work with other organisations as well and talk about it, talk about the issues and figure out what's happening. Because I've been in situations where somebody's come to us and I'm not sure if they're a victim of trafficking, and I would always reach out to the guards or the ICI or whoever it might be and just get in a second opinion. And that way we know that even if the person isn't deemed a victim of trafficking in the end, that we're still referring them into those services that they need because the vulnerabilities are there.
Thanks, Paige. Yes, anti-trafficking, I don't know the name again. You have the floor, yes.
The name is Jennifer Campbell.
Jennifer.
Yes.
Please.
I think a few things. We at Immigrant Council, one of the major thing we do is representation of women that have been trafficked, sexual exploitation specifically. But sometimes it goes more than those three core things that we've highlighted now. Because it's not. Sometimes there is also the silence. There are so many factors, there are so many indicators when you're looking at victims that has been trafficked. And when it's a minor, it's a different ball game altogether, because sometimes they start off with friendship. There are so many elements to it, and aside from those three indicators, they are very important, they are very relevant, but it goes way more than those three major indicators with regards to minor. That's one of the things I would say. But you see, one of the things that is really not happening is that assessment of vulnerability, because like Charlene mentioned, vulnerability means different things to different people. And sometimes what you might not consider vulnerable or vulnerability might be a vulnerability to somebody else. So it's very complex, it's very complicated, and there is no one size fits all that you use this model or this method to check who is vulnerable and who is not vulnerable, because vulnerability comes in different forms and in different shapes. So that's one of the things I wanted to highlight on. But on the other hand, one of the things I wanted to ask with regards to the presentation that Charlene made, you made mention of when people are taken back, that you assist them. The area I was interested in, if you can shed more light on it, is when they get to the country of origin. When they get there, for example, with regards to medication, we know that one of the things that make people to be trafficked is poverty. So if poverty is one of the driving factors that has made the person to be in the place where they are from the onset, how then is that person ensure that they are not being put back into that very position where that caused them to be trafficked in the first place? I'm asking this because aside from working with Immigrant Council of Ireland, I'm doing I'm in my final year PhD, studying the experiences of migrant women trafficked for sexual exploitation. And there is a lot of overlap between what I find in my research and what I see when women walk through Immigrant Council. There is a lot of overlap. Their lack of awareness is a big thing, because one of the things I've noticed, and then with regards to dealing with women and from my research, is the lack of awareness, especially among migrant communities. Because most of the time, yes, it's true. Most of the time, awareness is created, but it does not get to the people that needs it the most. Most migrants don't understand what trafficking is. People that are trafficked, some of them don't understand. They know something is being done to them that it's wrong and they don't want to be this, but they don't have a name for it. They don't understand what it is. So you see, it's very complicated and it's very complex. And when we say awareness, awareness is not getting to the people it's meant to go to. That is a fact. The migrant communities, because it's not only migrants, even native Irish are being trafficked. Let's get that straight. Native Irish are being trafficked, but the majority of women trafficked for sexual exploitation are migrant women. So the awareness is not there within those communities. That is one. And then when you take them back to their country of origin, how? What is done to ensure that those women or boys or men, as the case may be, poverty is one of the core driving factor, one of the core driving factor. How do you ensure that those people are not put back in that same situation that made them vulnerable to be trafficked in the first place? So if you can shed more light on that, I'll really appreciate that.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Yeah, Bridge.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there just with 2 quick points. Jennifer, you made an excellent point there. The act and the means and the exploitation that I was talking about is really, I suppose, just the 3 things that need to be there under legislation for it to be considered a victim of trafficking. But of course, when we're assessing whether somebody's a victim of trafficking or not, we look at a whole host of indicators. It's not something that we could possibly cover today. You know, you'd need a couple of days training in that. But one of the starting points we always encourage people to look at is the Delphi indicators, and I've just put a message up in the group. It's DELPHI. So Jennifer's completely right. Indicators can look at, it can be anything. You know, a passport can be taken, they cannot be getting their wages, they could be displaying bruises, they could be starved. There's so many indicators that somebody is being trafficked and being exploited, and this is why one of the things I know the department wanted to look at as well is training and how to get that message out there, because Jennifer's also right in that a lot of the victims that we've assisted to return home, they didn't consider themselves victims of trafficking. They don't use that language, they don't acknowledge that they're victims, and they don't understand it or see it that way. And a lot of the time we've seen people who would turn around to us and say that actually if he did pay me what he promised he'd pay me, then I would go back to the job, you know, and for them to come to a realization that they were in a situation of exploitation, it can often take them months or years to come to terms with that, and they need psychological intervention. So for us, an awareness raising campaign, an easy target is the public, because if the public know what to look out for and they know what the indicators are, they can see that the person in the car wash down the road, maybe he's not being treated the way he is, and maybe the way he should be, and it might just start a conversation and generate questions, and people can start to look out and hopefully refer victims of trafficking into the services that they need. But also we do need to get that message out there to migrants and potential victims as well, and it's something that we are looking at, and we'd love to do something maybe next year and a collaboration with a lot of the people that are on here to see how we might be able to do that. Definitely.
Thanks very much. I don't know if Charlene has anything to say, but if not, I'm going to ask Ahmed to come in. Charlene, do you want to say something? No.
No.
Okay.
I might just, Ajit, sorry, just one. I know, Jennifer, you asked a question about what happens when that person returns home. So we might just touch on that in a few minutes, because we will talk about it a little bit in the presentation as well. And sorry, we'd let Ahmed jump in there.
Yeah, Ahmed.
All right, thank you. I just, in terms of the 3 things that you mentioned, there is a trend that is, I think it's coming up with, whereby the parents are complacent in terms of, there's an issue you mentioned, trafficking and smuggling, where there's a lot of child bride now coming into the country. In the essence, the parents play a role, and also kind of put an age in terms of their vulnerability. The parents would be complacent with the person, they're marrying the person, and they're saying they're older than 18, and some of them they're 16 or 15, so that the parents, for them, it's poverty that's the issue, that they're allowing their children to come into the state with an older person. And then when we meet some of them in terms of in our workplace, and then the person tells you that they're underage, they're not over 18, but on their passport and all the issues that they have, it shows it. So the identity that they have is over 18. And their parents were complicit in saying, okay, they gave the consent to this person getting married. So the issue is saying there, traffickers find different ways. And also in terms of saying, also some of the parents in different countries, they don't know in terms of what they're letting their own children, in terms of they're thinking, okay, it's greener pastures for their children going abroad to different countries. But for us, in terms of seeing those situations, it becomes complicated. How do you advocate for a person who on their legal papers, it says they are over 18 years of age, but themselves they're telling you they're not. So as you're saying, here, if you report them and say, this is the situation, what assessment do you do in terms of vulnerability assessment if the person is telling you they're underage and they've been trafficked? If you look at that case, as you say, is it smuggling? Is it trafficking? And in terms of the statute in Ireland, it's still complicated in terms of issues of trafficking, in terms of vulnerability. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of education in also the country of origin and also in Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. That's a very positive contribution, Ahmed. So I'm going to give the floor back to Charlene and Bridge. Bridge, you are muted.
You're muted.
You're not sick of hearing my voice yet, no?
Yes.
The next thing we were going to just touch briefly on was the national referral mechanism in Ireland. What happens when a victim is found, how and what to do. So I suppose, as Lilini mentioned, the NRM is currently being reviewed, which is great for Ireland. The details are probably, it's going to take a while, you know, how these things work. So if the review is taking place now, there will be a recommendation made to Department of Justice, and then they'll review it and see how they can change it. But as it works at the moment, we'll just explain briefly what the NRM is and how it works. So basically, it's a framework for identifying or referring potential victims of trafficking and ensuring that they receive the appropriate support. So it is a document that has been laid out, and the relevant actors have come together and said how each of them will support a victim of trafficking once somebody is identified. So the first step is the decision is made to identify a person as a potential victim of trafficking. Now, what's important here for Ireland is that at the moment, the designated authority is the Gardaí. The evolution of the national referral mechanism came from, I suppose, the recognition that a lot of the victims of trafficking in Ireland were migrants from non-EEA countries at the time. Now, since then, there has been a call that this simply isn't true. I don't know if it's always not been true or if it's just not true now as things have developed. But a lot of the victims we see are Irish nationals, and they're also nationals from the European Union. So it is an outdated model that the national referral mechanism is tied to an immigration system. So this is something that's currently under review, and they're hoping that, you know, the Gardaí will always be involved. They have to investigate and hopefully prosecute the cases, but they're looking for the decision making to be more of a collaborative basis, is my understanding. But we'll have to see what the recommendations are. So step two. So I suppose step one is when you find a victim. So that could be through an NGO, it could be through a member of the public reporting it to the Gardaí, it could be through the Gardaí themselves. A lot of the time we see victims actually self-presenting. They've managed to find a way to escape. The Gardaí will do an assessment with that victim. They'll, sorry, pardon me. I think Charlene will agree with me that over the years that we've been working with victims, we have seen how the Gardaí have really changed over the last few years. That they really do open up the conversations to try and identify vulnerabilities. And we've seen it where Gardaí have picked up people on street corners for dealing Class A drugs. You know, it is a criminal offence. But rather than just putting that person, you know, convicting them and putting that person in prison, they actually sit down and do an assessment with them, and they've discovered, you know, indicators of trafficking. So they really are putting, I suppose, a victim-centric approach forward, and are really trying to ensure that victims are identified and looked after, rather than just looking at the criminal aspect of it. So once somebody is identified then and they're put into the national referral mechanism, they're referred to a whole host of supports. which we do have them on the next page. Step 2 would be a recovery and reflection period. So a victim of trafficking is given a period of time. It's 60 days, if my recollection is right. And this is particularly important for non-EEA nationals because their immigration status is also tied to this, where they would be awarded a visa to stay and have a recovery and reflection period. And what this is supposed to mean is that the victim can take the time to reflect on what's happened, recover a little bit, be referred into the supports that they need, and then make a decision on whether they want to move forward with cooperating with the Gardaí or not. And then step 3 is linked to a temporary residence permission, where if the victim just like the visa can be extended. It's not just 60 days. Like the Gardaí do look at that with the services that are working with them to see how they can help and if it needs to be extended. But then a residency permission can be granted if the victim agrees to cooperate with the Gardaí and if the Gardaí are investigating the criminal case. So the support services available, they try and take an holistic approach to this, but it's legal advice, accommodation, medical care, exceptional needs, working training, advice on personal safety, and then return. So I suppose the legal advice, it comes through the free legal services and also the likes of the Immigrant Council of Ireland provide good legal advice to victims as well. Accommodation at the moment has been provided through direct provision. There's been a lot of criticism of this in the TIPS report and also through Greta. And there's been an acknowledgement that this needs to change. They are looking into this to see how it can be changed, and hopefully we'll hear some news on this next year. But at the moment, victims of trafficking, both male and female, are placed into direct provision. Children would always go into foster care, the foster care system. So medical care, they're referred for everything you can think of. I mean, that can start with STI screening. There's also psychosocial support. But I suppose what we would point out here is that it is mainstreaming services, which we all know how our system can be overburdened. So a lot of the time, a lot of the organisations, a lot of them are on here, would end up having a response where they might hire like a psychotherapist or whatever it might be. So the likes of Ruhama are heavily involved in providing psychosocial support to victims for sexual exploitation and things like that. So there are dedicated services out there as well, but for the state, otherwise it's into state services. Then the rest of the bits there, exceptional working and advice. So there's the anti-human trafficking team of the HSC. They're a team of social workers and care workers who, when a victim is identified and they go into the referral mechanism, they are assigned a social worker, and the social worker will meet and assess the vulnerabilities of the victim of trafficking and come up with a care plan for them. Now, this can involve getting them English language lessons if it's needed, referring them into the likes of medical care, social support, getting exceptional needs payment. They can get them, advice from the Gardaí and things like that on how to stay safe, what to do if your trafficker contacts you again. And it can be a medium and a long-term plan for the victim while they're trying to rebuild their lives. And then there is return and reintegration, which is through IOM, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So I would encourage you to contact any of the organisations there if you want to learn more about what they do, because they really do great work for victims of trafficking in Ireland. Okay, so this is something Charlene mentioned a little bit earlier, and we did say we'd go into it a little bit more in depth, and we'll open the floor then to answer some of your questions around voluntary return as well, and what we do with vulnerable people and people who might be in need of protection. So what we decided to do was just go through a case study with you of a victim of trafficking that we assisted before. And the idea is that, a lot of people say to us, IOM, oh, you return, you just book a flight, you help them get from A to B. And we wanted to go through the level of assistance of a particular case just to illustrate that it can actually sometimes be so much more. So for this lady, we were contacted by the Gardaí in relation to a lady who she had been trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. This was the initial contact, and she wanted to return home as soon as possible. She was placed in a Midlands direct provision centre. So our response is we'll try and go and visit someone as soon as possible. There'll always be 2 caseworkers assigned and interpreters will be arranged if needed. So we went to this direct provision centre to meet with her, and we met with the investigating officer from the Gardaí. She was extremely traumatised and terrified, and this is why we met her with the guard. Often we meet with victims of trafficking, and it would be IOM and the person having a one-on-one conversation. Like, we'll always take a referral, and we always try and get as much information in advance of meeting someone as possible, because we're very conscious that we don't want to re-traumatize somebody. But often we will meet someone one-on-one as well to try and build up trust, but it always depends on the needs of the victim, because the victim might not be comfortable meeting us one-on-one, and if that's the case, we'll meet them with whoever they're comfortable with, whether that's an assigned caseworker or the guards, whoever it is. Now, in this case, the Gardaí she wanted to go home, and the Gardaí said to us that they would like us to arrange her travel as quickly as possible for her own safety and security. They wanted to move on the exploiter as quickly as possible, and they felt that there could be potential repercussions for her. So they wanted us to assist to move her. She, in the meantime, had to attend a sexual assault trauma centre for evidence collection, but we managed to arrange her travel within 48 hours. So what this involved was we went to meet her, did an initial consultation, and did a vulnerability assessment to see what her needs are. We also do what we call a risk assessment, and basically this looks at who's been involved in the trafficking, who knows about what happened, and what we try to do is assess the safety for her returning home, but also the safety of the staff who were working with her. We went to her accommodation centre, we picked her up, we drove her to Dublin Airport, and we were with her the entire time that she was in Dublin Airport. So this is her story. I'll let Charlene jump in here.
So this case, I just want to tell you that this case really actually affected myself and Breach, because what was different about this case was this girl actually came here to meet a guy that she'd met online, and she had been so excited, and she had explained that excitement to us. So and she had gone through it and all about the whole process of planning to come here. So, and it was so very, very real. So basically, Anne met a man online via Facebook, and over a number of weeks they got to know each other, and eventually they got involved in a relationship. And Anne was actually an educated, trained social worker living in a third country at the time, and she was eager to move to Western Europe in order to pursue a career here. And she also had a very difficult situation in her own country, whereby her mum was quite ill at the time, and she was reliant on Anne in order to cover her medical costs. So Barry asked if she would be interested to move to Ireland, and they could live together and get married and start a life. And the other thing I would say was, as Anne was actually in her mid-30s, and at that time she said that a lot of her friends were in relationships and in long-term relationships whereby they'd settled down and had started having children, and she had desperately wanted the same for herself. And this is something that she told Barry, but she'd also explained to Barry the pressure that she was under in terms of looking after her mum. So Barry knew all of this information before Anne actually even got to Ireland. So Anne did move to Ireland, and the night that she arrived here, Barry raped her, and it was quite a vicious assault. The next day, Barry apologized and said that, gave his excuses, and he asked her to go and work in his business, which was a car wash. When she was working, he actually kept her wages. He gave her little to nothing to eat. He took her passport, and she worked long hours with no breaks. Now, what added to this was at nighttime, Barry would invite his friends over to the apartment that he was sharing with Anne, and he would allow his friends to assault Anne. One of the days when she actually complained, he got a car door and he slammed it against her leg. And her leg was still actually badly injured by the time that myself and Breach actually went out to meet her. So she was walking with a limp, and she had a bandage on it. every time that Barry assaulted her or raped her, he would promise never to do it again. And he convinced her to stay, but he continuously used the situation with her mother against her, and continuously said that her mother's life depended on it and what opportunities would she have in the country of origin. So he basically used the information that Anne had given him against her. So that was the control method that Barry used, and also the amount of investment that Anne had put into the relationship in terms of, you know, leaving her country, her home country, packing up her belongings. She had left her apartment, she had invested mentally and emotionally in coming to Ireland, and she said to us at the time that it was something that she really was grieving the loss of, was this future that she had planned for herself, and this was all used against her. So like when we got to the actual airport with Anne and we were assisting her, she was so badly assaulted that we had to go to a pharmacy and buy her sanitary products because she was still bleeding after the assault. And you know, as in myself and Breach were upset, she was upset. And it was just a very bad situation, but she still, to that point, she still spoke about her relationship with Barry and how she, you know, she questioned what had gone wrong, what had she done. So you can see the number that Barry had worked on her, and the coercive control, the relationship, and the information that Barry had extracted from her in order to keep her in the situation. So I suppose when we go and we meet people and we you know, to take an application, a lot of the times, you know, we go into an in-depth discussion about why, you know, what had happened, why they're in the situation, how they're feeling. And sometimes people do ask us, you know, why do you need this information if you're just booking flights? And it is important, and we're going to go into why it's important. And I suppose it all goes around and goes back to the type of support that we offer, and, you know, setting up the pre-departure assistance, the travel assistance, and the post-arrival assistance, and offering a full package of support so that there is that safety net in order to stop the trafficking from happening again, and put supports in place post-arrival in order for her to, or him to, reach out to once they do return.
And I suppose I know Jennifer had to leave, but I suppose one of the things we would always say is that, and Charlene did mention it earlier, is that we do sit down and we do have these conversations so that we can put a package in place. For victims of trafficking, we work quite closely with the missions in the country of origin to ensure the supports are in place when they get home. So for example, like this is a case where we assisted her to go quite quickly, and our mission in her country were able to assist us quite quickly. But we've had other cases where people have come to us and they immediately said, I want to go home, I want to get out of this situation. We've sat down, we've done an assessment, and in order for us to assist that person, we need to look at certain things. Like that might be accommodation, we might need, you know, if there's a family member involved in the trafficking and they can't return to that situation, we would look at shelters and things like that. So sometimes return doesn't happen as quickly as the victim or survivor might want it to. But we do it to put certain safeguards in place. So we would work with the IOM missions in country of origin, but also NGOs and state services to try and put in as many supports as possible. And that would be, you know, shelter accommodation, linking in with legal advice, linking in with medical care, linking in with the police in the country of origin if they feel comfortable to do so, depending on where they're going to. Sometimes they don't. And then particularly with children as well, there's a whole host of supports we do where that we can carry out DNA testing to confirm the relationship. We can arrange for social work assessments through either local social services, or if the social services aren't very well developed, we often have a qualified staff member on staff who can travel to meet with the family and do a social, you know, a family assessment, take photographs and things like that, just to see where the child might be returning to and if it's a safe location. So we will not assist somebody to return home until we know there's a certain level of supports in place. And if we find that those supports don't exist, then we would encourage the person to speak to their legal representatives here or their caseworkers here to see if what options do exist. You know, we had a lady one time, a Romanian lady, who, when we asked for her address in Romania, she told us she was born, she lived in the cowshed down the road from a house. So in that circumstance, we were looking to see if we could place her in shelters and all types of things before we could return her home, because there's two very important things for us is that we want to try and protect people and make sure they're as safe as possible. And we also need to make sure that their situation in their country of origin or country of return, it needs to be better than the situation they're leaving here. You know, we don't want to return someone to be homeless or whatever that might be. So there is a whole host of things that we will look at before proceeding with a voluntary return. So I'm conscious that we have taken an awful lot of time today. So I'm just wondering, does anybody want to comment on anything, or does anybody have any questions or want to give an example of a scenario or a case that they've worked with before? I mean, I know there's always a lot more detail we can go into, but I'm conscious that we're short on time.
Okay. Yes. Somebody
Yeah,
wants to
there is a case I came across which I found quite sad, and maybe I can share it, Breed.
Yes, please, Caroline, please do.
Yeah, thank you very much. The case involved a woman who was trafficked from a country which I will not name, and on the night when she was being trafficked, she had a passport ready, air tickets, and then those people, they came with a small child, like 7 years old, and they gave that girl, or that woman rather, that child, and the child had already been coached to say that that girl is, that woman is her auntie. But she told me that when she looked at it, so they traveled with the child, and she first met that child at the airport, and that evening when she was traveling, and when they got to their destination, she told me the more she studied that child, she could see the boy was not 7, he was older. So like here we have a woman who has been trafficked, and then she has these she's responsible for another human being whom she just met. So now our situation is quite precarious right now, because like what she's been telling me is that whenever there's something small, the child says, if you don't do for me this, I'm going to report you. I'm going to say you are not my mother. And then there are also other threats coming from the child's family to this girl, like if you dare like drop this child or say anything or leave him alone or expose us, we are going to do something terrible to your parents and your siblings here. So I find like balancing that even in my head and reconciling everything very, very difficult, Breed.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
And do you come across such cases?
Pardon?
Have you come across such cases in the line of your work?
We've come across a handful of cases like that where, yeah, and it's quite terrifying when you hear some of the threats that are used against victims. And I suppose what we try to do in those situations is refer them into, I suppose, some of the experts that are here in Ireland. Like, you know, some of the NGOs have some really good supports, and I think maybe psychosocial supports are quite important there, that somebody can, legal advice as well. So the likes of the Immigrant Council of Ireland would be quite important, where they can sit somebody down and explain to them what the situation is, and that this is actually a threat that's being used against them for this person, and to explain to them that if they wanted to leave this situation, you know, the type of supports that could be put in place, like that, you know, she could maybe go into state supported accommodation, that maybe the child could be taken into foster care, whatever it might be, in, you know, in that situation. Obviously more detail would need to be given, but I think that's a huge problem that you've acknowledged there, Caroline, that a lot of the time there's so much fear there that I've worked with people before who have come to us and they're still in their trafficking situation, and they won't leave it. They're afraid to leave it. So trying to get them to a place where they feel safe and secure enough to leave a situation can be quite challenging. And it can be frustrating as well when you're trying to help somebody. But I found that I just try and refer them into somebody like the Immigrant Council of Ireland, where they can build up a level of trust with somebody over a number of weeks or a number of months sometimes, that can help them get to a place where they might feel, I suppose, brave enough and safe enough to do something.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Breed.
Thanks, Bridge, unless you want to say a final word, and we're going to conclude here. I'm just aware of the time.
Yeah, just really to say that I know we only scratched the surface today, and a lot of the content would have been familiar to a lot of you. But I suppose just the thing for us is that every single case that walks through our door, a lot of the time we don't even help them with a voluntary return. They just reach out to us for assistance, and we refer them on to somewhere else. But the level of vulnerability that we're seeing with every single case that walks through our door, I feel things are changing, and I feel that COVID-19 has just added to this. So it's just great to see so many faces and organisations on here today, and I hope that we can continue our collaboration. And if anybody has any questions, my email address is there. I would encourage you to take a look at the trafficking website, where the campaign is running until the end of December. We had a little bit of a break there, but we're planning on doing a push for the last 2 weeks at Christmas. We just want to get as much information out there to the general public on trafficking, so please do share.
Thanks very much, Bridge and Charlene, for the wonderful presentation. And I would like, it's my honor to thank all of you who attended this webinar this morning. I'm sure you get to know what IOM is doing in this field. And we were also very pleased and honored to hear about what you are doing from your different organizations and your positive contribution. It's only one word that is needed here, and I think Bridge said it, collaboration. It's only if we work in synergy, in collaboration, that we can provide good support to migrants who are really in need. And we've had it, victims of trafficking, they are a specific case of vulnerable migrant that we can meet, but we cannot always take it for granted because you don't know the background of the migrant. So if we work in collaboration, we'll be able to identify not only a migrant who is vulnerable, but a migrant who may have been victim of trafficking and provide a very appropriate service that can really bring a positive change into the life of migrants. Again, thanks very much for attending this morning. Jennifer said that the people who are really in need of those informations are migrants themselves. So next Saturday, we are going to have a webinar on support that IOM provide to vulnerable people, and a specialist from Geneva, our headquarters, is going to speak on that. So we are going to address this webinar particularly to migrant leaders and faith leaders of migrant communities. So we would seriously invite you to those webinars. We're starting at 12 on Saturday. So if you're available, we will be very much pleased to have you on in this webinar as well. Again, thanks very much, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.